You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 347 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. I got a lot to cover on today's show, including the U.S. relationship with China, shaky right now on the trade front, and then some territorial water disputes in the South China Sea, updates on Venezuela, and I want to look at U.S. media coverage of the events in Venezuela, and then Iran, where a big deal was made about a carrier strike group being deployed to the Persian Gulf. And a lot of people are now asking about the likelihood of war with Iran. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. Best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where you can find my show and my daily news roundup in the right-hand column on that page. And then, what you do to help the show, what makes it grow, is that you're either taking the time to send that link to somebody or to just post it up on your Facebook or social media. And that way more people get exposure to it and listen to it and hear, these really important events going on around the world and, dealing with the U.S. empire. Once you've listened to the show for the first time, I'm sure you'll want to subscribe to it. So iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, it's everywhere. Give it a rating and a review if you can. And then patreon.com/foreign policy focus for those of you who love the show and want to help it out with by throwing a few bucks my way. All right, first thing I got on today's show is an announcement here by the Pentagon claiming they only killed 120 civilians in 2018. Is just an absurd claim. We look at airstrike fatalities in Afghanistan at record highs. A lot of that is because the U.S. is bombing a record amount. It wasn't that long ago on the show I was talking about the special investigator looking into the Afghan war, saying that the Iron Tempest mission, which was just to take really expensive aircraft and bombs and bomb $500 Taliban opium labs, was an absolute failure. But it also killed a lot of civilians, which, makes it even worse because of the insurgency, the blowback and everything. And so this, number is clearly just low and untrue. Like I said, the casualties in Afghanistan far exceed, I think, what the totals the Pentagon claimed them to be. And then when you look at kind of secondary kind of things like Yemen, where the U.S. isn't directly bombing, at least not very often, and killing civilians, where they don't even count any U.S. civilian killed in Yemen in 2018, but you had the, CIA drone war going on there. And I've certainly reported on Immersion News and in my news roundups that, their sources saying that there's people dying in those countries from U.S. bombs. In Somalia, I think the Pentagon counted 2. We know that number's a lot higher, but we don't know how high because there's nobody there reporting on it. And the Pentagon doesn't even reveal the strikes unless they're asked about them. And so a lot of times they just go unreported and untracked, and nobody knows how many bombs right now we're dropping in Somalia. It's well above the Obama totals that Trump's doing now. Of course, there's no additional congressional authorization for this. And in fact, it seemed that at the beginning of Trump's term, he was prepared, to just leave Somalia. What are our troops doing there? It was Mattis who told him that he would have to stay. But I guess in maybe Trumpian fashion, he says, well, if I'm going to stay, I'm going to get this over early, so increase the number of airstrikes. And he did declare this area of active hostility, which I think lifted some of the oversights and chain of command around the airstrikes, making them easier to call in, and I think put some more U.S. troops in Somalia. While tensions certainly, have died down in 2018 over 2017 in Syria and Iraq, that doesn't mean the U.S. hasn't been carrying out airstrikes there and killing civilians in those countries as well. Libya, again, the U.S. is somewhat active in that country. And then we really don't know about the rest of North Africa or even the Middle East as far as the CIA drone strike program goes, because we just don't have that data or get any of that information. So now may be a good time to skip over to what's going on in Afghanistan, talking about not getting any information out of the Pentagon on how bad our wars are. And Danny Sjursen writes this article. I'll link to it in the show notes page. Danny's great, a former Army major, teacher at West Point, and veteran of the Afghan war. So what kind of, better analysis can you get on it than this guy? And he says that, yeah, it makes sense that the Pentagon's not giving the data anymore. They're losing the war that bad. But overall, it's obviously a failure. And if they continue to report the data, they would have to do one of two things. They would either have to adopt a completely new strategy that would, likely be something resembling a surge, or, more counterinsurgency strategies like you saw with Stanley McChrystal back in the beginning of the Obama term, or you would have to leave. Now, the somewhat decent news has been that the U.S. is now engaged in 6 rounds of talk with the Taliban. It seems that generally the announcements post-talks have been positive, and the Taliban have put forward that, they feel like things are moving in the right direction here, nailing down kind of a timeline with the U.S. foreign exit. Now, the bad news is just because Donald Trump is the president and commander-in-chief and sets the U.S. foreign policy doesn't mean, I guess, the generals fall in line. And you had General Dunford, who I believe right now is the commander of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, coming out and saying that the U.S. will stay in Afghanistan until the insurgency is defeated. Now, maybe he used some real careful language and, he's going to tell Trump, well, I guess if you make a deal with the Taliban, there's no longer an insurgency. But this sounds awful lot like, to me, trying to set that standard that we have to defeat the insurgency before leaving. And if that happens, we're certainly not going to be, able to follow a timeline set by the Taliban, because I don't see how you ever completely get rid of an insurgency in Afghanistan. If there's one thing the Afghan war has taught you, is you can't do that. And I mean that, again, that's the reason they're not reporting this key data, is because after all these years of war, it turns out that the Taliban are holding more territory now than ever before. And so it shows that the war is just an absolute failure. All right, next I got a story on the recent conference of Arctic nations. I think there's 7 or 8 in this group that include Russia, China, and the U.S. The conflict here actually focuses around the U.S. and Canada, where there's a trade route that I think goes from like the west coast, Alaska, to the east coast of the U.S. That passage cuts in Canada between the mainland area and some of the islands north of that. And if you look at a map, I think most people would think that these would have to be Canadian waters, but the assertion from the Americans is that no, they're international waters. The Canadians did not respond favorably to this, I guess of no surprise. However, the meeting didn't end up adopting any kind of language that supported the American position. I'm going to keep my eye on this and see if it is the cause of any future conflict, more diplomatically than any kind of anything else that could happen between the U.S. and Canada. But this may be something that's important to Canada. And, maybe next we'll go to China, where we could see more territorial water disputes. So on China, I think the big story that people are more familiar with is the trade war, where that seemed to be on the back burner for quite some time. But then we had Trump announcing a coming increase from 10 to 25% tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. I believe China says that they will respond kind of in kind, but maybe this is a direct response to the trade policy, or maybe this is just because the U.S. has been doing more in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. But China, I've noticed in the past couple of days, has come out and made statements against U.S. ships being in the South China Sea in waters claimed by China. In the past, I've said that if you look at a map, it doesn't seem to me that the claims by China are really fair. And if you look at the types of treaties that have settled these problems in other areas, they would certainly, give some of these territorial waters to the Philippines and Vietnam, or make them international waters. But as an American, that's not really for me to decide. I just wanted to give that as a little bit of context. But the U.S. takes a very active role here anyways, and that's why it's important. I've noticed, and I recently saw an article on this, that there's a really increasing presence of Coast Guards being used here. And so they're kind of called the white ships. I guess Coast Guards are painted that color for whatever reason. And I mean, I know the U.S. has deployed Coast Guard missions out to the South China Sea, but now it seems that some of the countries tied to the U.S. in the region, Japan and the Philippines, are also taking a more active role with their Coast Guard to try to enforce what they claim are their territorial claims. Now, the U.S. really can't have any territorial claims in the South China Sea. However, we're sailing our guided missile destroyers around those islands at this time, and that's something that China is saying no to. Now, this has been an ongoing issue between the U.S. and China for some time, and so in one sense, there may not be anything to worry about here because there's always a lot of talk, there's always these competing claims, but at the end of the day, the status quo is just going to go on. But at the same time, I think there's a couple factors here that are worth knowing. It seems the Trump administration is taking these actions more frequently, especially sailing the warships through the Taiwan Strait, which China has a real issue with. There's also the fact that the U.S. and Trump are really waging this trade war against China. And so the more trade breaks down, which is still really strong. I mean, there's still hundreds of billions of dollars going back and forth between our two countries. And that's the most positive sign going on. But if Trump continues to, add these tariffs, it works against that. And then last, Trump is surrounded by a bunch of people who I don't think are very wise on foreign policy and I think are very hawkish, including Mike Pompeo, who apparently has gained some foreign policy advice on China from some bad people, including one guy who's claiming that China is like a fundamentally different civilization than the U.S. has dealt with. And so that makes it like more complex and it's going to be more difficult. And this seems to be something that Pompeo has bought into with Iran, viewing it as a clash of civilizations. And so if somebody is able to convince Mike Pompeo is able to convince the president that, well, Mr. President, there's really nothing you could do with China because our civilizations are just too different. I think Pompeo's suggestion is going to be the same thing to do with Iran, which is, attack it. Now, of course, this is completely ridiculous. I mean, if you want to look at a civilization that's pretty much the complete opposite of America's, look at Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan. Women aren't even allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. Afghanistan, I don't think women could even own property and, depending on which government at which time. Taliban rule was certainly oppressive, but the government before was, okay with raping little boys. So there's not much, kind of the great Western progressive values going on in Afghanistan. So yeah, I mean, the civilizations are different. The cultures are different. Rural Afghanistan is about as different as you could get from, where I live in Boston. And you can't really say that China is, the most different, but I think it's just kind of the war propaganda that they're using. And it's concerning that they're using this kind of language because I think it's the kind of stuff that Trump and Pompeo will buy into. I'll link to the article by Daniel Larison, the American Conservative, in the show notes page. Myanmar has released 2 Reuters journalists, the president there. The president granted the pardon along with, I think, like 6,500 other prisoners. These 2 journalists served in prison 511 days for reporting on the country, Myanmar's government, which I think is a little bit separate than the more civilian side of the government, waged an ethnic cleansing campaign that killed thousands and pushed hundreds of thousands, if not a million, of an ethnic minority group of Muslims called the Rohingya into Bangladesh in fear for their lives, where they now live in very poor refugee camps, and some of them can't come home. Some of their villages and territory have been destroyed and probably doesn't feel very safe. And so that's what the journalists were reporting on. The government there helped cover the whole thing up. And now these 2 journalists who are doing, from what I understand, good work, have finally been released. And so hopefully they go somewhere where they could be safe and maybe they could talk more about their story now and what terrible things are happening to the Rohingya people. On Venezuela, there's a few things I want to cover here. One is I saw this statement by Mike Pompeo where he was really saying that he didn't think the U.S. or Trump would need to consult Congress before taking action in Venezuela. Now, maybe he used this language to be very slippery, and if he was really nailed down on it, would the president ask Congress before starting to drop bombs and have a D-Day style invasion of Venezuela? Pompeo would say yes, but that's really not what's going to happen. It'll probably be a more slow moving thing, at least at first. And then the first kind of U.S. military action will be to take immediate action against some crisis that if the U.S. doesn't take action will end up horribly. So look at the bombing of the Khorasan group in Syria, which was plotting terrorist attacks. Look at the first action against ISIS, where it was the Yazidis that, were stranded on the mountaintop and under attack from ISIS, and every last one of them was going to be slaughtered unless the U.S. did something. Or the, people of Benghazi who were all going to be slaughtered to death by Gaddafi. I could go on, but just leave the list there for now. So I think it would be that kind of action that they take first. And Mike Pompeo obviously doesn't want to say that, no, the president would consult Congress, because he probably won't if that's actually what happens. I don't see any progress in Venezuela as far as Juan Guaido's attempt to claim the presidency there. I'm reading that the U.S. is going to try to put out more what they're calling incentives. Basically, they're going to sanction people in the Venezuelan government who are supportive of Maduro, and then offer sanctions relief and maybe even aid money or whatever else to anybody who decides to defect against Maduro. So now we're essentially bribing people in Venezuela to turn against their government. I don't think that, this necessarily ends well. It seems to me the kind of thing that would cause a reaction from Maduro to actually be more repressive. If everybody is, being offered money to turn against him, he'd probably start to feel a little bit paranoid, wherein everybody may be the one to stab the knife in his back, and him to maybe be more repressive and brutal to keep anybody from thinking that way. Not that, the U.S. policy then justifies Maduro acting that way, but I think it's probably going to contribute to that kind of situation rather than having Maduro just quickly overthrown. It seems that Maduro is maintaining his popularity in Venezuela. For what it's worth, when protesters show up, the government crowds are always quite larger than the opposition crowds. One thing that I've noticed a lot of people reporting, and that these are people on the left, so you may say they have a little bit of a bias, but I heard this from Paulist, and well, that's the name I remember right this time. But that a lot of this is all breaks down a lot on ethnic lines here, where I think native and black population of the country tend to support Maduro, while the European descendants tend to support the opposition. There's also a lot of class stuff baked into that. Traditionally in Venezuela, prior to the Chavez revolution, that was the class that was, I think, receiving the least amount from the oil revenue, whereas post Chavez revolution, they are seeing a lot more wealth from the oil revenue. So now I want to talk about coverage of this. The mainstream media has been absolutely awful. Washington Post, New York Times. There's an article in Fair. I'll link to it in the show notes page because it really goes through and documents how each different source really hasn't given any room to people who say Maduro is the legitimate leader of Venezuela and the U.S. shouldn't attempt a military overthrow. The one exception to this that I've seen has been Tucker Carlson, who had somebody on from the Gray Zone. And I think it was Douglas McGregor, but it may have been Daniel Davis. I'm just getting them confused. To kind of come on and give an anti-regime change position. And so I think that's really huge. First of all, everybody on the left should be completely embarrassed that Tucker Carlson apparently is the only one in the mainstream media who could see past the socialism cries and the, brutal dictator cries to say that, hey, the Venezuelan people get to make their own decisions and the U.S. shouldn't go kill a bunch of them in order to try to liberate them. Remember Iraq. But that is the state that we're in. I will say I saw this framed really well at a post on the Libertarian Institute. I'll link to this in the show notes page as well. And this is what I should have been saying all along to libertarians, that this is not an issue of socialism. This is an issue of liberty. The Venezuelan people get to make their own decisions. They get to elect their own leaders, and the U.S. can't be involved in that. And so that's the position that libertarians in America should be taking, not get rid of Maduro because he's a dirty, filthy communist, which he is. And, hopefully one day the Venezuelan people decide that free market capitalism works better and, the government isn't corruptly just going to give all the oil wealth to some people who then get to rake in all the money while everybody else suffers, but they figure out some way. I think I've seen Doug Casey propose models on this kind of thing where state companies are broken up and given in shares to the population, something like that, to allow the people to, gain some wealth from the oil fields, but in, a private setting, not in the fact that the government is just taking the money out of the ground and giving it all to them, and, giving them more control over what their government does and everything would be great. Some stuff on North Korea here. They've launched 2 either short-range missiles or rockets into the sea as missile tests. As far as I could tell, nobody is claiming that this has anything to do with nuclear capability, so these won't be that big of missiles. Maybe they're small statements of defiance from the North Korean leader, but this is certainly played up big time in the media and really tried to use against Trump. Look how stupid you look. Yeah, your old pal Kim Jong-un is carrying out missile tests. Now, Trump made what I thought was a great statement, saying that he's supportive of the South Koreans giving food aid to North Korea. We know that there's been a pretty bad drought in that country, and apparently food rations have been cut again. And if South Korea is allowed to provide food aid, it may be one of those kind of trust establishing things that could help to bring those 2 countries closer together and then make no need for U.S. intervention at all. And wouldn't that be fantastic if the U.S. doesn't have to be involved in a war on the Korean Peninsula and the Koreans could just get along on their own? North Macedonia held elections. I've broken down kind of the name change issue in this country, with Greece being what long time prevented Macedonia from joining NATO. And now it seems that the person elected is kind of pro-NATO, so I guess that means pro-name change, and will continue to facilitate Macedonia's entrance into NATO. All right, Iran. The U.S. deployed the carrier strike group with, I guess, the USS Abraham Lincoln being the flagship there, the aircraft carrier, to the Middle East. Now, this is something that I don't think would ever catch anybody's attention that isn't, very interested in foreign policy, and I tend to see these things happening, but don't usually find them worthy of talking about on the show just because, who cares where the USS Theodore Roosevelt is at any time, unless it's somewhere to carry out some kind of mission. A lot of times if an aircraft carrier is on the move, it's because another aircraft carrier is headed back to the home port and then this one's going to replace it. And if you talk to the Pentagon, I think that's kind of what they're saying. This is just kind of a standard rotation. The U.S. typically deploys an aircraft carrier to the Persian Gulf. There isn't one right now, and that's why the Abraham Lincoln is moving there. Now, Mike Pompeo says, no. The reason that this aircraft carrier is being deployed is to counter threats from Iran. I also saw the acting Secretary of Defense, Patrick Shanahan, saying that there were multiple credible threats against U.S. interests in the region from Iran, I think including in Iraq. I've seen some tweets and articles from what you would call kind of the blob, the foreign policy establishment thinker, somebody at the Hudson Institute, I think his name is Michael Pageant, saying that he was concerned about green on blue attacks coming from what I guess would be his militias in Iraq, like the Popular Mobilization Forces. They're Shia militias. I guess there's some Iranians in within them. Some are just Iraqi Shia who are supported by Iran and were supported by U.S. airstrikes when they were fighting against the Taliban, or not the Taliban, it's ISIS. But that with the U.S. increasing pressure on Iran, adding all these sanctions and trying to push the Iraqi government away from Iran, maybe they do provoke a green on blue attack and some soldier sees now the Americans as a target and, turns around and shoots an American that is actually trying to train him. I don't think at all Trump would agree to this kind of thing, meaning that we have to go to war with Iran, but I could see him maybe signing on to some kind of limited strike against Iran, like we saw with Syria, where there was the allegation of chemical weapons attack in Khan Sheikhoun in Douma, and Trump responded by carrying out 100 or so airstrikes against Syrian government targets that he claimed were either tied pretty deeply to the Syrian government or were, making chemical weapons. So something equivalent like that. The problem I think would be is that Iran is in Syria and could actually fight back. And so this could, I think very quickly turn into a bigger thing. There's also some B-52 bombers rotating into Qatar. This again, I believe, is a pretty standard rotation that, there's been 4 or 6 B-52s in Qatar, I think since the Iraq war started. So there are reasons that I am more concerned about this now than I was before. One is Netanyahu has won re-election, and he certainly seems to be empowered by Trump's undying loyalty towards his government in Israel at this time. We see moves recognizing the Golan Heights, moving the embassy to Jerusalem as being big steps in U.S. policy towards being more supportive of Israel. Along with, I heard that the intelligence of the credible threats against the United States came from Israel, and Israel has long postured against war in Iran. There's the fact that we have the JCPOA now seeming to start to break down a little bit more. The U.S. is looking to add more sanctions against Iran, removing the waivers that was allowing Iran to export oil to India, China, and some other countries. Certainly, I think adds to the Warhawks case to the American people for a war with Iran, and I'm sure to Trump as well. Hey, look, now they're backing out of the nuclear deal. Well, of course, the U.S. pushed them there, and the Trump administration is 100% responsible for ruining this thing. What they should have done is taken Obama's policy of making peace with the Iranians and just enhanced it. More trade with the country, more exposure to the West, help reformers and people open to the West like Rouhani, improve his country's economy so the people want to vote for him again, rather than go back on a nuclear agreement that was a political risk for somebody who, was not the choice of the Hawks in Iran. Rouhani's not the puppet of the Ayatollah. He was, for more relationship with the West. And so that kind of stuff I think really hurts and is a real setback in the relationship. You also have Bolton and Pompeo, who are just, I think, almost to the level that some people accept religion. They accept that there is going to be a clash of civilization between the U.S. and Iran, and that we need to wage that war and win it. Why? I don't know. What threat does the U.S. present to the United States? I don't know. They can make up a whole bunch of fictitious stuff. They could talk about, there's U.S. military personnel within range of Iran. Well, that's because the U.S. is in countries all along Iran's border, not because Iran is doing anything militarily towards the U.S. I think the best breakdown of all of this is on the Moon of Alabama blog. So I'll link to that in the show notes page for those of you who want a little bit more detail and inside baseball on this. But overall, we're definitely not moving in the right direction on Iran. I don't know if any kind of all-out war is likely. Maybe there could be a kind of short skirmish between the two countries that gets put out. I mean, we certainly see this in Israel, where there's been some recent skirmishes between Hamas and the Israeli army that is, largely at the expense of the civilians. I mean, this time I think you had a couple Israeli civilians die, along with a lot of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. I mean, the Israelis have a whole lot more firepower, and so when they're leveling buildings in Gaza City, it kills a lot more people than a Palestinian rocket that you really have to be unlucky to be killed by one of these rockets. I mean, one hit a guy's car and that explosion killed him, but these aren't huge bunker busting bombs or anything like what the U.S. and Israel uses. A couple other notes just of those Israel-Palestine skirmishes. Everything was really blamed on Hamas for launching 600 rockets against Israel. Of course, what everybody leaves out is before that fighting started, Israeli sniper killed 2 Palestinian protesters. And then there was a brief skirmish between Hamas and Israeli forces on the ground at the border of Israel and Gaza. So, these kind of things can happen where there's a short skirmish, a few people die, a lot of bombs are used, and then a ceasefire is reached and this all gets called off. But I think there's a real danger that, it spirals out of control really quick. So definitely need to keep our eye on it and also make a lot of noise about it. No war with Iran is very important. I'm trying to run through this Yemen stuff real quick here. We have the UN finally getting access to the grain silos at the port of Hodeidah. That food had been sitting there for months. 51,000 tons of grain sitting in silos in Hodeidah. And there can't be enough of a ceasefire between the two sides to allow the aid workers to safely get access to it. They believe some of it's already rotting, but they're going to be able to turn some of it into flour and then get it out to the Yemeni people and hopefully put food in a lot of people's bellies that are absolutely on the brink of famine at this point. UN numbers are now at 250,000 people dead by the end of this year. Who knows what the real casualty figures are, but the longer the fighting goes on, it's just going to be higher and higher. fighting is going on more severely outside of Hodeidah. I think the Houthis are looking to make some gains in southern Yemen, kind of on the highway linking the capital city of Sana'a to the southern port city, which is the kind of temporary capital of the official, quote unquote, Yemeni government that mostly hides out in Saudi Arabia, of Aden. And so this could hurt transportation and food getting to the people in southern Yemen as well. The UN is calling for the release of 3,000 Ethiopian migrants who somehow or some reason traveled to Yemen, where they are put in detention facilities by the Yemeni government. So that's the US, Saudi, UAE bad side, and those places are pretty brutal and disgusting and inhumane conditions there. And last, there was this interesting story about the range of the Houthi drones being a lot longer than anybody had originally thought, about 900 miles. And so this puts a lot of targets in Saudi Arabia, and I believe in the UAE as well, in range of these Houthi drones. And maybe the way this war actually ends up starts to slow down and the Houthis are able to negotiate something with the opposite side is by putting more of their, big targets, whether it's, I think it's the King Mursaid Air Base in Saudi Arabia, or they've, talked about targeting nuclear reactors in the UAE, or the airport in Riyadh, or the presidential palace in Riyadh. And so these kind of threats, some at civilian targets, and that's not a great thing, could maybe force some kind of ramp down to this war, because it doesn't seem like it's going to come from the U.S. at this point, with our attempt to override President Trump's veto on the Yemen war powers being defeated. All right, that's it for today. I hope everybody enjoyed the show. Foreign Policy Focus at libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, immersionnews.com, facebook.com/libertarian union, at KYAAALE on Twitter,